may I switch a little bit to some other topic? There is something which has been occurred today several times, which I might title a little bit, saying a little bit stronger perhaps than it was said here, and call it a leadership crisis in Estonia, meaning that from the first session to the last, we have heard that there is not enough strategic thinking on the top. You mentioned this politicians' wish to think only to, or ability to think only towards next elections. But even if we would make the changes, what Jüri Raidla this morning suggested, that making Prime Minister really a strategic institution instead of being a chair of meetings of the government, do you think there would be enough people to do this work? Do we need to do something to get people attracted to politics?
Well, I have never really bought the smallness argument. That I mean, let's face it, most of the underpinnings of Western civilization were created in about 50 years in a city-state that had 40,000 citizens. Okay, well, the women weren't citizens and the slaves weren't either, but even there, the maximum is 150,000 people in Athens between 450 and 400 BC. I don't think that, I mean, clearly there are economies of scale when it comes to economy, but when it comes to good ideas, I think that we have enough people to come up with good ideas. And I would say in many ways the success of Estonia emerging from Soviet occupation, I think surprised everyone precisely because of the ideas that people had and the new ways of doing things. And so I'm not really, I don't think we have a problem with enough people, being a small country, coming up with ideas. But certainly getting out of some of the rigidities that have been formed over the last several years. The fact that we were successful in the period of, say, 89 to 95, 96, in new ideas, I think, I don't know which panel it was, but I mean, has now led to, we have always done it this way, and therefore we can't change it, or we've never done it any other way, so we can't change it. I mean, it's this sort of arteriosclerosis at a very early age, I would say, that we are here only fundamentally 18 years old, and what was successful in 1993 seems as if it's the only way of doing things. We also have a strange post hoc ergo propter hoc attitude towards some of the reforms. I mean, let's take, for example, I mean, this is not, I don't mean to raise this politically, but it's more looking at it intellectually. I mean, one thing that was very successful for Estonia was the flat rate income tax. And the flat rate income tax is something that was successful because it was a brilliant economic idea. Well, I don't think it actually was brilliant in that sense. It was brilliant because it led to a dramatic increase in compliance, meaning that people paid their taxes. It was much easier to pay their taxes, and every country that has instituted a flat tax has got, it's not the philosophical economic benefits, it's that all countries enjoy, as soon as they impose a flat rate income, a massive increase in people paying their taxes. Well, maybe we can think about other things. We don't need to just stick to something that worked at a time when nobody paid taxes. We have to stick to that simply because we think it's a superior economic model. Maybe we can come up with some new ideas. I'm not saying that we should change the tax system, but I'm using that as an example of how we may misperceive or in retrospect say certain things were successful for the wrong reasons and keep a hold of it. And some of the reasons for Estonia's success, before I hand it over to Edward, is which little attention has been paid to, except by people like Anders Oslund, who an economist who writes about the post-communist world, is actually, I think, one of the keys in Estonia in the 90s was the law and government of 1995 that depoliticized the civil service, which was far more important in creating a professional civil service than people realize, unless you do the comparative analysis. And in most of the post-communist world, there was a rapid politicization of the civil service, which meant, which was understandable, because you had from all these countries finally said, okay, we're not being run by them, now we control it, and we will staff our entire civil service with people from our party, which was a model that they knew well. But in fact, the countries that politicized their civil service quickly had a serious problem that whenever the government changed, the entire civil service changed.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference between Estonia and a number of its neighbors, which its neighbors realized later on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when I meet an incompetent political appointee in Estonia, and it does happen from time to time, I'm always surprised. There are some other countries I go to where I'm pleasantly surprised if I meet someone who is a competent, apolitical public servant. And I think that Estonia has possibly gone backwards a bit on this over the past few years, but it's still a big difference. I think that for policy planning and long-term thinking, it's very important, it's almost a necessary condition to have a strong civil service, because they can think about things independently of party advantage and follow things through to their logical conclusion. It's also a lot easier if you have an apolitical civil service to bring in outside experts who may have different political convictions to the party in power, but are still willing to give advice if it's giving advice to the state rather than giving advice to the government. The other thing I think is very important.
Let me just interject here, but our problem, I'd say, I mean, this happens in all of our countries, is that if there's if an error made not in policy but in the political side, then you still blame these nameless bureaucrats for doing things wrong, as if they are the problem, whereas the policy may not be one. The failure may not be at all in policy, but actually in the political decisions made.
Yeah, and ultimately the ministers have to bear political responsibility for things, but you can still have interesting ideas being at least considered under the protection of an apolitical civil service. But I think the other thing, which I think is a bad tendency, and I see it developing, is the idea of a kind of caste of professional politicians. One of the things that was very impressive, not just in Estonia, but all over the post-communist world in the 90s, was the way in which people came to politics from outside. People whose experience had maybe been as dissidents, or maybe as academics, or in the case of Czechoslovakia, as it was then, we had a foreign minister who'd been a stoker, stoking boilers, and we had another minister who'd been washing windows, and a president who'd been a playwright, but unable to get his plays performed. And that brings in a very healthy outside perspective, and it's particularly healthy when these people don't want to stay in politics. They're doing it for a bit, maybe there's a particular policy or particular project they want to get through, and then they're going to go back to what they may see as the real world. And what worries me very much is the idea that you can be a career politician. You go into politics and you stay in there for your entire working life. It's bad from the point of view of bringing in interesting new ideas from outside, and it also creates a kind of cartel which is very resistant to competition. And I speak with feeling here because the leader of the British opposition, David Cameron, has never really had a job outside politics, except very briefly working as the PR man for a television station where his job was to lobby the government. But so I'm not saying that other countries are perfect here, but I think you have a real chance in Estonia, just because you're small, to have a healthy revolving door between politics, between public service in the broader sense, working in regulatory bodies and other public institutions, and the private sector and academia. And all four of those are different parts of public life and service to the country. And it's tempting to imagine, for example, that a board member of Skype, for example, might then be education minister for a bit, and might bring some perspectives from that to bear on the education system, and that perhaps a minister from some other part of the government might then go off to be something important in the private sector, and treat that in a clean and non-corrupt way, but make that revolving door work.
One thing which we haven't actually mentioned at all here, which is fundamentally different for Estonia today as opposed to where it was, and which actually has not been a very big part of our discussion today, is our membership in the European Union, where, in fact, except in terms of joining the Eurozone, again, as a case of mass mobilization, but in fact, very much of what we do today is in terms of policy is either defined by, or at least in some senses organized by, the European Union. And I would say it's one area where Estonia again stands out positively, in that Estonia has the highest level of EU support in the European Union. And that's not a given. If we look, the next country south has the lowest level of support for the European Union of anybody in the European Union. And there are actually very, very similar countries in terms of size, economy, history. And one thing which I should praise Estonian politicians for is that despite all of the economic bad news, we are not making a habit of blaming our problems on the European Union, which is a very common thing in the European Union. And where I would fault Estonian policymakers, politicians, is in a review of the performance of the new member states in the European Union, a fairly technical review. Estonia was found on reviewing all of the decisions of the Council, hundreds of them. Estonia had the least or the fewest initiatives, and it voted most with the general trend. That is to say, we didn't have any new ideas and we didn't stand up for anything against the general view, which led to the sort of tagline was Estonia is a policy taker, not a policy maker. And I think that's something we should, I think that is new. That is something that is not part of our identity. We're supposed to be creative, innovative, come up with new ideas, and now we are following the herd.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you're still, to some extent, basing your image on the things that were 5 to 10 years ago, that the very successful privatization, flat tax, e-government and Skype were 4 big hooks to hang the outside world's perception of Estonia on. And I can tell you how bitterly jealous some of your southern neighbors are. Because if you say 4 things about Latvia or 4 things about Lithuania, to give outsiders a hook for their image, it's much harder, and you're lucky you've got so many. But they are all quite old. And I haven't seen, I think the new big ideas coming out from Estonia are not really there, and I don't see much in the pipeline either. So I think that's very important. And I think one thing that is a bit of a disappointment to me is the poor. I think there's almost been an idea that government's only job is to get out of the way. Government's job is to cut taxes, get out of the way, and let us get on with making money. And as a free market liberal, I like that. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one. It's not a sufficient one for a good society. And I think perhaps the best example of this is the extraordinary mess that's been made of Tallinn. Now, Tallinn is, in a way, the most, and you see it on every box of chocolates, on every postcard, that famous Tallinn skyline. Tallinn is a tremendous asset for Estonia. If you're telling people, why should you come and live in Estonia, a picture of Tallinn, Old Town, is quite a good introduction. And I've watched with real dismay. I used to go to Sochi a lot, and I used to like Sochi very much. And it seems to me that the Estonians have ruined Tallinn pretty much the way that the Putin regime has been ruining Sochi. building these, a great jumble of mismatched, badly planned skyscrapers, positioned without any idea for how the city's going to look. And that depresses people. People don't think, if you say to someone, you're staying in the Telegraph, they go, yippee, that's really nice. I like staying in the Telegraph. It makes me feel I'm going somewhere special. Of course, I guess nobody here stays in hotels in Tallinn. You probably don't even know where these hotels are. I'm speaking to someone who spends a lot of time in hotels in Tallinn. And there's such a difference when I meet visitors who've been put in the Swiss Hotel or the Radisson or the Olympia or the Viru, and they say, well, that's great, you get a great view out of these hotels, but you might as well be anywhere else. So I think that to try and recreate the idea of government as something that adds value and makes things better is tremendously important, not just getting out of the way and letting, for example, property speculators get on with making money.
Well, I think that, yes, I mean, that's perhaps a discussion that we really haven't had enough of in this country, is that, I mean, I think that there is a very broad consensus in this country since 1991, or 92, that the government does not have a role in business. I mean, but it seems to be a wholesale capitulation that there, in those areas where the government does have a role, it really is confined to paying. I mean, because at the same time we have the huge percentage of our budget that goes to entitlement programs, to Social Security, and so forth. But in terms of actually actively thinking about, well, how do we solve quality of life? What do we do to make people want to live in this country and not leave? What do we do with our higher educational system so that we don't have the best and the brightest all wanting to go somewhere else? I mean, these are issues that really are governments over time. Because I think the mindset is that, well, government is a priori bad. I think that we need to get over that. You don't need to be. We don't need to have a positive. You don't need to be a communist to believe in a positive role for government.